stuff to incorporate in this chapter. Updated data. He wrote and said, today is my day. I'm working on it. He said, even though I'm on vacation with my wife, and it's one nice day.
He's dedicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just sent off the notes.
Very rural Alaska.
17 pages. Last time was 20.
Wow.
Actually, in the Western Alaska, they're growing.
Well, Lexi and I have made a working days on Sunday, so I'm gonna work. I'm gonna start working all weekend.
They're growing
Actually,
without
I can tell, it's not
any
bad.
economic base.
And did you finish your?
Why?
Just
Yeah, I
a lot
just
of
need to do
kids
one more.
Kids
Kids.
and then
I moved up like you did, and Lexi helped me a little with thinking about how to make the data look a little better.
I thought that was fine, but yeah, I just thought it was more stark.
And I talked to Bear and he said there was a group that was working on this a few years ago, and he said we should probably need to.
Hello, yes.
Everybody sits around me.
I know.
You're going to
Pretty
find
good. Practice my projections.
When are you done?
With the dissertation? April. I'm defending.
I'm usually here all day.
Really excited.
Are you done writing?
Yeah.
Now, are you applying for jobs right now?
Yeah, my husband and I really want to stay in Alaska, so I'm only applying in Alaska. It's like a, I don't know, hope that for some reason if I just dive in like that it'll work.
Where are you applying?
There's a couple of jobs, one at UAS, teaching job, and then one that just opened up at UAF. They're looking for social ecological system sustainability.
Oh, wow.
In which department?
That's an SNRAS.
Okay.
And it would be, I think, joint syndrome.
Yeah.
Well, they just call myself.
I got my master's degree through that program.
Did
When
you?
it used to be
These guys.
SALR. Now it's Sunrise.
Right.
Theoretically, I'm on their advisory board.
Okay.
But no, I haven't heard from them in 5 years. And so I was like, did you guys disband? And they said, no, we're still in meetings.
That was my
I guess I lost, but we never got it.
In this area, one of the villages are dying.
There's some interesting.
Yeah.
We are in the beginning
Because
stage.
I love Juno, but I don't think the opportunity.
Still
is
planning.
Yeah, I'm torn. You know, I really love teaching. Oh yeah, I love it.
As user friendly.
At the same time, I know
Oh.
the junior jobs for more of an interdisciplinary program is not quite as focused on my topic. And then there's things going on at UAF,
Yeah.
right? Doing what I'm doing, so.
Yeah.
And then no fish I can get, you know, I'm really not doing much.
What is your husband?
He's in the resilient
Taking time
Oh,
with you,
he's a PhD student.
What's that?
He's looking at oil and gas development and
not from my
I
body.
think how to change the ice reduction and how that's going to open up the opportunities for development.
Oh, yours.
Yeah,
From
next
the
week.
social sciences.
Yeah. So
What is he
you'll be
working
in
with?
touch with what we're
Amy,
Looks really
Okay,
good.
thank you.
That'd be great because
So Doug's one of my students.
I think.
Oh, is he? Okay.
I want his,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
because he's mostly doing education stuff, yeah, I'm
he had a
his
meeting
goal
with
advisor.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are trying to stand out. To be the first one.
What time does your phone say?
How are you? Well, I'm fine. I thought I better come and get a fight.
All right.
Okay, so there's a good collaboration between all work.
That was in the hallway.
I'm working on the telecom. I'm here working
Yeah,
on.
awesome.
Jess.
It's okay.
Jess.
All right, I might actually try to call us to order, bring us all together. And I know everybody here, so I don't have to introduce anything other than you probably don't know that if an earthquake hits or a bomb goes off, actually both of you probably don't know, we need to use those stairs there that go straight outside the building and not those stairs there. That's our safety announcement. But Gunner is out of town, so I'm acting.
I don't remember having to say
Director.
that.
We're supposed to always do a safety.
It won't help
talk.
Orla, no matter what.
But I think what I'd like to do, because we're a small enough group, and I think it'd be advantageous for Maureen to know who you all are. Maureen is, the announcement that was sent out talked about her being a doctoral candidate, Department of Geography, but she's also right now an adjunct professor in the Resilience and Adaptation program at UAF. and hoping that she's going to stay in Alaska. So, go back to Pennsylvania, defend, and then come back and be here permanently. That's our goal. Yay! More fun people who want to be here. So, I'm going to let her introduce her research, but we can quickly just go around the table and introduce yourselves, because some of you are people that Maureen may want to be talking with more. This way? Sure.
I'm Heather Hudson. I'm on the faculty here and an ex-director and work mostly in communication and infrastructure and social and economic development.
I'm Mara Kimmel. I'm also a PhD. And I'm working on governance and well-being and labor rights issues.
I'm John Wheeler, the researcher here.
I'm Matt Reimer, an economist here at ICER.
I'm Bob Leffler. I'm a half-time visiting professor. I'm visiting from West Anchorage. And I sort of teach courses and do some work in natural resources.
I were met earlier with
I'm Roz Montgomery, the researcher here.
Sort of a research associate.
I'm Chloe Snout. I'm a researcher here.
I'm Arla Sturgeon-Lewski, and I'm on the advisory group for ISER.
Martin Sudak, I'm a computer science, do modeling of complex systems and non-linear dynamics.
And actually heads our complex systems group here.
Oh, cool.
Jess Spangler, I'm with Fairbanks University, but located down here. I work with the EPSCoR program and a couple of other projects in town.
And I'm Josh Kendra. I'm the legal affairs manager for Alaska Oil and Gas Association.
And Matt Biermann, another economist.
Cool.
Here. All right.
Great. Awesome, thanks. Thank you guys all for coming. This is a big group. I'm excited. So as Diane said, I'm currently a PhD student in geography at Penn State University, and I moved up here to Fairbanks a couple of years ago with my husband, who is doing his PhD in the Resilience and Adaptation program at UAF. He's looking at climate change, the opportunities presented by sea ice melt for oil and gas development and how that's going to affect people in the Arctic. So he dragged me up here while he's doing that research, and it actually has provided me a lot of great opportunities for meeting with people who are doing similar research to me, looking at adaptation to climate change. Since climate change is obviously such a big issue here. My research has focused mainly on the African context, developing country context. Yeah, and I've done a lot of research in Tanzania, a little bit in Ghana. And that's what I'm hoping to talk with you guys about today, is to give you a little bit of an overview of a small portion of my dissertation. So in this presentation, what I'm really going to do is ask how adaptation and development work together or against each other in one specific climate finance mechanism. And this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Adaptation Fund. I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a minute, so it's okay if you haven't heard of it yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a critical development lens. So that's a very specific theoretical lens coming out of work on development within the social sciences. And I'm going to use that to examine how different stakeholders know adaptation, how they understand adaptation, how they conceptualize adaptation. And then how they link that idea of adaptation with development. And before I begin, I really want to just give you a broad overview of what I mean when I say development, since some of you are probably more familiar with it than others. Broadly, when I'm talking about development, I'm talking about this sort of abstract notion that there is a progression that countries, individuals, societies go through over time, and that it's usually conceived of as an improvement, and it's often tied with very specific economic, infrastructural, and social changes. How it actually takes place usually is through aid and investment. So how it's promoted is through aid and investment on the part of developed countries within developing countries. So giving money, giving technology, giving help to make these changes happen that then are labeled as development. At the same time, there's a lot of very specific critiques about development. The biggest one is that it's not successful. So we've been doing it now for maybe like 60 years, if you look at some of the early things that were happening in the 50s. And we haven't seen a whole lot of changes taking place. Things just aren't really working. There's also a lot of unintended consequences. So people might go in very well-intentioned, wanting to help developing countries, wanting to help people living there, wanting to make improvements, and at the same time, they just aren't successful. They don't work. There's negative side effects along with the positive things that might actually happen. And then a third major critique is that a lot of the development that's done is in the name of developing countries, but it's actually really serving to support what's going on in developed countries. So it's giving jobs to people from Western countries, from the US, from Europe. It's bringing money to them. It's promoting welfare in developed countries by benefiting people who are working within the developing countries, but who are not necessarily from those developing countries. And so what starts to happen then is that you end up with development projects going on, and instead of allowing these benefits, this progression, stepwise development improvements to happen, what you have is that there's consolidation of power within very specific elite groups in these countries. There's negative side effects happening, and then there's also sort of a reinforced dependency relationship between developed and developing countries that happens at the same time. So while things might be very well-intentioned, we have a lot of negative things that are happening at the same time. So what I'm really looking at with my research is how adaptation, what's going on with adaptation to climate change now is serving to reinforce what's been going on with development for a long time. So I want to start with a really broad question, which is, what is adaptation? What is it? What do I mean when I say that? In general, adaptation refers to any kind of responses that people make to the impacts of climate change. So this could be to try to take advantage of some of the opportunities presented by new weather patterns, new climate patterns, and this can also be changes that people make to avoid the negative consequences of these impacts. I began conducting my research in Tanzania on local NGOs about 7 years ago. This was for my master's research. And I participated in a couple of other research projects, both in Tanzania and Ghana since then. And what I found is that people are so aware of what's going on. You say, oh yeah, climate change is happening, and they're like, duh, right? I can't farm, I can't fish, things are changing, I see this. And sure, this is like the same thing that's going on in Alaska. People don't need you to educate them on this, they know that it's going on. At the same time, there's a lot of frustration going on, in particular at the local level, because people see these problems, they often know exactly what they need to do to adapt, and yet their hands are often tied. Either because there are broader political things going on, or economic contexts, whatever, things that are preventing them from doing exactly what they know what they need to do. And then this frustration is really compounded by the fact that they are often aware, or almost always aware nowadays, that they're not responsible for these changes. So they see the responsibility lying firmly in the laps of developed countries where there's been major industrial growth, things like that. Greenhouse gas emissions are skyrocketing there, and yet the effects are felt most significantly within these developing countries. So because of all this, well, I started out doing this community-based research. I, as a researcher, became really frustrated because I was like, what's the point in trying to go in and help people adapt when the problem doesn't lie with them to begin with? The problem lies with what's going on in this broader context, with how we're even conceiving adaptation to begin with. Because most often now, when you see it talked about, it's really talked about at the community level, at the individual, often at the household level. Within NGOs, at least within governments, they're saying, how can we help individual people, individual households or communities adapt? Rather than saying, how can we create a context that's conducive to adaptation to begin with? So what I wanted to do was to really pull out why the discourse is focusing on the local, why it's not focusing on the broader contexts, and to really try to understand how it ties in with development, because it is increasingly linked with the development in the literature. And there's really interesting debates within a lot of the academic literature coming out of geography in particular about what the difference is even between adaptation and development. Is there a difference to begin with? For example, if you look at any of these pictures, would you be able to look and say, okay, the seawall that somebody built, is that an example of adaptation or is it an example of development? This new rice seed that this guy's using, is that adaptation or development? You can't necessarily parse it out so clearly when you're looking at the level of an individual project. Interestingly enough, all of these pictures are pulled right off of the Adaptation Fund website as examples. Very specifically, they say of adaptation, not of development.
But are they, those terms aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Some adaptations could be very helpful for development, some might be hindrances or very.
Absolutely, yeah, it's not clear, and I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It doesn't necessarily need to be clear. At the same time, there are interesting differentials that are being made because of how it's funded in particular, and so I'm going to talk about that exact question in a minute. So I'm arguing that one specific way to better understand this relationship between adaptation and development is to look at the institutional structures that are starting to employ this concept of adaptation. So climate finance in the present. So in the present, I'll just let you guys take a look at this for a second. This is one of the more simple visual aids that they have trying to explain what's going on in adaptation finance. Honestly, it gets like successively more complex the broader scale you look at, and soon you get these images that really look like bowls of spaghetti with like arrows pointing everywhere, connecting everything. It's crazy. And so this image, though, specifically is the Adaptation Fund. Now, the Adaptation Fund is a mechanism that was established under the Kyoto Protocol in 2001 under the United Nations. And it's currently the only mechanism that exists with the sole purpose of funding adaptation. Other mechanisms exist that fund adaptation along with mitigation or along with various kinds of technology transfers for improved emissions reductions, things like that. But there's only this one funding adaptation alone. Actually, that's not fair. There's one other one that does fund only adaptation, but it funds it in just least developed countries. This funds adaptation in all developing countries. So within the structure of the Adaptation Fund, the relationship between adaptation and development is blurry. So institutionally, it's really not a clear divide. And part of this is because there's a lot of institutional overlap between the Adaptation Fund and various development structures, development institutions as well. So there's a standalone board of 16 UN representatives that govern the Adaptation Fund. At the same time, the trustee here, which is the banker, the fund banker, that's the World Bank. And then implementing entities, specifically the multilateral implementing entities, those are also a variety of development banks or multilateral institutions, such as United Nations Environmental Program or UN Development Program, Asian Development Bank. There's a range of them that actually implement the projects under the Adaptation Fund. So right off you can see that while there's the Adaptation Fund, it's working alongside these historically development-oriented institutions as well. And then also the Secretariat, they're not on this confusing map here, but they do all the sort of bureaucratic overseeing of the fund. That's the Global Environmental Facility, which is a huge, also environmental protection and development institution as well. So at the same time, while you have this sort of confusing institutional overlap between adaptation and development institutions, you also have some really neat, unique things that the Adaptation Fund is doing to differentiate itself from existing development institutions. And there's three really unique things that they're doing. So the first one is called direct access. And direct access is it's a new way of actually allowing countries to access the money. So historically, when you have development aid coming in or development funding coming in, it comes through something like the World Bank or UNDP. And that would be an example of a multilateral implementing entity in terms of who executes the project. And the Adaptation Fund has created an alternate to that, which is a national implementing entity. And this actually allows countries to get the money themselves directly. So instead of having to go through the World Bank to get the money, they can hit up the fund for the money and a proposal themselves and get the money themselves. This gives them obviously a lot more control over how the money is spent. It keeps a lot more money in the country rather than paying it out to people working for World Bank or whoever. So it benefits developing countries in a lot of ways. And again, this is really unique. This is not something that has ever existed as far as I know within development institutions. And it really gives countries a lot more control over the projects on the most basic level.
So a question.
Sure.
Your graph over there has a bidirectional edges between the nodes. And so far, everything you said only implies the flow from top to the bottom. Can you talk about the flow from the bottom to the top?
Yes. I can. So, brief overview. I didn't really go into too much detail about this, but you have a board, the board, right? 16 members. Also, I want to point out they have a majority developing country representation. So they have, I think, 65% of their representatives have to be from developing countries, which is another massively different thing from most development institutions, funding institutions. So the board, working with a trustee, which is the World Bank, who doles out the money, they decide who gets the money. And then the trustee actually gives them the money as the bank, and they'll give it to, for example, UNEP, being one of the MIEs. And then UNEP will work with different organizations, often local organizations on the ground in the countries. So for example, in Tanzania, there's a couple of local NGOs that are working on this project, and they actually they go back and forth, theoretically, with the implementing entity to determine what the project's going to be in the first place, to build a proposal, and then to actually execute it. So the bidirectional thing going on here is implying that there's a lot of stakeholder say at the grassroots level about how things happen when they're writing a proposal and then when they're actually enacting it.
Maybe this is a question for a discussion. So quality assurance, if a school is being built properly, how is that being monitored from the lowest all the way to the board?
Yeah.
Because any project is only as good as what is actually
done in the end.
And how.
Absolutely. No, this is a huge problem. This is something that they're really talking about. It's the problem of monitoring and evaluation, and nobody's quite sure about how to do it yet. In particular in the Adaptation Fund, simply because they've now only been working or funding projects for 5 years. The first projects only actually started happening, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. So they've got different checks in place about reporting back along the project about how things are going. And honestly, it's not. In my opinion, this bidirectional arrow doesn't really usually exist.
Okay.
From what I've seen. And they're trying, I mean, again, this is really well-intentioned people at the board really want things to work out. And at the same time, it's problematic because for 2 reasons. One, or at least 2 reasons. One is that it's just really hard to track all that information, to get money, to get the institutional infrastructure in place to be able to track all that information. And then 2, there's a lot of various stakeholders along the way who are going to try to trap resources for themselves so that things don't actually happen the way that they're supposed to, right? The other side of this then over here actually is the national implementing entity. This arrow here indicates that they have to be approved by the board in order to be a national entity. And then again, same, all the other arrows are the same. It's super confusing, I know, so yes.
So the national implementing entity is a part of the government in that nation?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this right now, so, or in 2 slides. So hold on 1 second and I'll get into that a little bit more. So far I've talked about the 2 things that make the Adaptation Fund really unique from other development or other institutions, especially development institutions. 1 is the direct access, the national implementing entities, which are a function of the direct access. 2 is the majority board rule from developing countries. And then the 3rd one is how they're actually funded. So sources of adaptation funding are one way that climate finance has really challenged the development paradigm. And the Kyoto Protocol has provided a mechanism that levies a 2% tax on certified emissions reductions on clean development mechanism projects. So what this means is that developed countries can invest in mitigation projects in developing countries. They can build a wind farm in Kenya. Germany can build a wind farm in Kenya, claim carbon credits for that in their own countries so that they discount some of their own emissions in Germany. In order to do this now, though, for that to be allowed, they have to pay a 2% tax. And that 2% tax goes into the Adaptation Fund.
So it's a tax on what?
It's a tax on the carbon credits that they're buying. So they buy credits for doing mitigation in the developing countries so they can emit just as much in their country by offsetting some of their credits. And then they're taxed on that. Okay. So what this does is it effectively requires developed countries to support adaptation in developing countries. It's a mandatory tax. They can't avoid it. Unfortunately, the price of CERs has dramatically tanked in the past few years, and they're basically worthless now. And one Adaptation Fund board member really cynically put it, next slide, carbon is now cheaper than a McDonald's hamburger. And it literally is. At the time that I got that quote from him, which was just about a year ago, a little less, the the cost of carbon credit was, actually it was only 6 months ago, it was down to 15 cents. So for every carbon credit that was sold, they were earning only 15 cents. Overhead they have to pay to the World Bank, their trustees, was 8 cents on that 15 cents. They were really making only 7 cents off of each carbon credit sold. This gets into carbon markets. A lot of the economists in the room probably know a lot more about this than me. This is the limits of my knowledge here, but they're not selling a lot of these to begin with, especially since the price is so low. It's not being traded. It's basically worthless, and they're not bringing in any money to the Adaptation Fund account at the moment. So at this point, CER levy is no longer contributing any significant amount to the Adaptation Fund. And so instead, the Adaptation Fund is turning to rely on voluntary donations. And so even though they had this really noble attempt to be different from other development institutions, they're sort of being forced, just because of market fluctuations, to go back to the normal development paradigm of voluntary donations, voluntary aid. And this has really prompted the board to, as they say, as one person said, to quote unquote rethink their product. And so now they're starting to think of adaptation as a product that they need to sort of convince developed countries to invest in over time. And one board member argues that, quote, what we are saying today about adaptation is nebulous. We're not being clear about it. Maybe it's time for us to rebuild and express our argument so that it is better linked to biodiversity, energy, water, and development concerns. We don't know where the boundary is between development and adaptation. So his argument is really that they need to find new linkages between adaptation and development in order to keep adaptation relevant to developed countries who might invest in their institution. So, going on from that, let's just look at how they currently define the relationship between adaptation and development. I'll just let you guys read that. Can everybody see that in back? Mm-hmm. So what we see is that the Adaptation Fund is really heavily interested in protecting the development process. To be funded, proposed projects have to demonstrate concrete outcomes and actions that deliver tangible results. They can't simply be capacity building projects. So they can't simply go in saying we're going to try to improve health sort of generally, or we're going to try to improve the environment or build people's awareness or education on certain things. They have to actually come up with something concrete. And so often we see in the Adaptation Fund so far, the projects that have been funded include things like building seawalls to respond to rising sea levels, or what else is a really common one? Revitalizing mangroves, coral reefs, things like that. So a lot of very specific concrete things are being funded rather than these broader things that potentially could arguably be more beneficial to people. So here I want to draw our attention again to the direct access mechanism that I mentioned before, and this is where I'm going to answer your question. Remember that I said that countries can apply directly to the Adaptation Fund to receive the money so that they don't have to work through World Bank or UNEP or another multilateral. However, in order to do this, they have to pass a very rigorous accreditation process. So they have to demonstrate five main things, which are financial integrity and management, institutional capacity, transparency, self-investigative powers, and anti-corruption measures. And by all accounts from all the developing countries that I've seen that have applied for this, the sort of word on the street is that it's almost impossible to pass this. And I think it took like 5 years for the first 2 countries that got accredited to get their accreditation. And then since then it's picked up a little bit more. I think like 4 or 5 other countries have received it, but then it's sort of stabilizing now. Because it's just so difficult for them to demonstrate that they have any of these capacities. A lot of times countries don't have digitalized records of what they've been doing within the institutions that are applying, or they maybe have had issues with corruption or political instability in the past, and this just prevents them from demonstrating their abilities to fulfill these 5 criteria to begin with. What these institutions are, though, just to jump back a step for a second, often they're government entities. So in Tanzania, for example, they're sort of actually hashing it out politically who's going to be allowed to apply to be accredited. And it's, I think, like 3 different government organizations are all really wanting, like Minister's Environment, the Vice President's Office, and somebody else are all duking it out over who's going to be allowed to represent the country. Most often, what I've seen, it's a government, some sort of government office or organization that applies. Occasionally, it is a national level NGO that's given support from the government to apply as well, but that's more rare. Here, though, what I want to draw on is a specific concept coming from critical development theory and the work of James Scott in particular, called rendering legible. And what rendering legible is this idea that in order for any sort of governance to happen, the potential governing body has to first sort of regulate and clarify and process the object of governance in order for it to be legible to receive governance. So a great example of this that the guy who came up with this, Jim Scott, uses is census. So you take a census, and once you have a census about like whoever's living in your country, it becomes that much easier to create laws to regulate those people or to create benefits that will help people, or education modes that will then educate your people. But in order to do any of those things, in order to do any of that governance, what you have to first do is know who you're governing, render them legible, in other words. And I think I argue that what's going on here is exactly that. What is going on at the UN level is that they're really trying to render these nations legible so that they can receive funding. And once they're rendered legible, they become accountable to broader climate finance mechanisms like the Adaptation Fund. And at the same time, and it enrolls them. It enrolls these institutions in the process of channeling international economic flow. So it brings them in to the flow so that they can actually start to capture some of the flow. At the same time, in some countries, this process of rendering legible results in the consolidation of power and adaptation expertise within only the accredited institutions. And it disenfranchises other institutions at multiple scales, as well as communities and stakeholders and other people who might be interested in participating as well. And again, we see that a lot in Tanzania, where you already have different institutions duking it out because they know if they're not the accredited institution in the end, they're going to have significantly less say-so in how things happen. So implicitly here, we can see that the Adaptation Fund conceives of adaptation as being a forerunner of future development. In order to continue to develop later, we need to adapt now. At the same time, there's a bit of a catch-22 because there's a level of government capacity that must be developed before a government is viewed as capable of adaptation. This begins a sort of perpetual motion machine in which development and adaptation could theoretically be used to justify each other ad infinitum. So why does all this matter? Well, yes?
Off record, how feasible is that?
As what?
The census kind of to law rendering legible. Because I know that, Darfur, there is no way that people will be actually accounted for because they have this intrinsic distrust of the government.
Mm-hmm.
India, the same thing with taxation. They're trying to do the one bank account per person so they can actually account for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the scale you're talking about. So census would be like a good example of how a national government might try to render its people legible, right? And that's obviously feasible because we do it in the US and it works, right? We take a census in the US.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that we can do it in that easily.
I agree.
It's
totally context specific, right? And I think in the situation that I'm talking about here, my argument is that it is the United Nations, and not just the United Nations, but broader financial institutions and international, multinational institutions that are trying to render governance legible. They're trying to render, so for example, the Tanzania government legible by making it accountable, transparent. It has to show it's accountable, transparent, that it's got the managerial capacity to deal with all this money before it allows them to have this money. By making sure that it does all those things, then if they bring them into this flow of money, they can much easier track how that money is being used. They can track, but not just tracking it, it opens up a whole lot of opportunities for a lot of other people as well to benefit by that rendering legible. So a lot of other corporations, organizations, NGOs, whatever, might come in then and be willing to work with these organizations. Yeah. So feasibility totally, it varies from country to country. I think right now, like I said, there's only been like 5 or 6 countries that have been accredited, so it's actually really not feasible in a lot of countries. And that's exactly the argument that a lot of countries are making, which is like this direct access mechanism is kind of BS because nobody actually can get it, you know. So like South Africa, like some of the more developing countries are the ones that have gotten direct access accreditation, and the other ones are just like struggling along, knowing that they're still going to be reliant on the World Bank to get any of this money at all.
So when did the program start?
Adaptation Fund.
Yeah.
It was like invented in 2001, and then it went into action 5 years ago. I think the first project was funded 3 years ago.
How many countries got funded so far? All over the world?
It's a tricky question. One is they just had a meeting last week, and I haven't checked to see what they usually do like 10 to 15 new projects that they approve every meeting. I think it's probably in the 20s or 30s right now.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, like, corruption is kind of a big issue when they apply. Every year, Amnesty International, they publish the most corrupted, least corrupted countries. I mean, did you match those countries and see how many corrupted countries on the list still got the funding?
I did not do that, no.
Yeah, that actually can tell you how important corruption is when they apply for funding.
Yeah, you know, and there's some issues with the Amnesty International corruption listing that I've heard too. And I think you can't necessarily generalize to the whole country either. It's difficult.
Yeah, they usually publish the corrupted government, and it looks like the government themselves getting the money.
But no, not always. Actually, very rarely. Normally, it goes through United Nations. Normally, there's the two routes: the direct access route, when the government gets the money, or the multilateral implementing entity route, and that's when the money goes through World Bank or United Nations Environmental Program or another multilateral. In which case, the government never directly receives the money, and it's exactly for that reason.
Okay.
But you know, it actually is a very good question to see if there is any sort of correlation between who's even bothering to apply maybe for the accreditation process, and whether that ranks up with Amnesty International's transparency or corruption list. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. Anybody else have anything right now? Yeah.
Your reference to critical development theory
and
the whole logic about trying to make institutions and governments, or render institutions and governments legible.
Yep.
Not legible, legitimate.
Legible. Rendering legible.
Legible?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's the idea that you take something that's pretty disorganized and you make it somehow organized, or you render it in terms that are organized so that you can actually measure it, see it, account for it more clearly.
Okay. It sounds a little convoluted to me because the attempt was to make them legible, and after 5 years or so of work, there's like 4 or 5 countries that were eligible to be funded. That makes me wonder if the mechanism or the international organization, this fund, is actually eligible for these countries.
Yeah, that's a good. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion.
Yeah. I can wait if you want to finish what you're.
I'm right at the end, so how about I finish it and then we talk?
Yeah.
All right, but hold your question. So why this all matters? Well, by 2020, developed countries have pledged $100 billion annually to go towards adaptation to climate, to go towards dealing with climate change in general in developing countries. So that includes mitigation and adaptation. They have this sort of scale to build up towards that 100 billion by 2020. By 2012, the goal is to have 10 billion a year, and then I think they went up to 30 billion a year that they're supposed to be giving right now, and then 100 billion by 2020. And this is supposed to be new and additional aid. That means over and above what's already being given for development aid and other kinds of aid. And so in order to do this, they've developed this brand new fund called the Green Climate Fund, which if you haven't heard of it yet, you'll probably be hearing about it for sure soon because it's gigantic. It's going to be gigantic. And so they've developed this GCF, Green Climate Fund, to channel this $100 billion eventually. And though they have they've already built the physical structure in Korea. I think it's been built for a couple of years now. And as somebody on the Adaptation Fund board said, he said, I wouldn't say the GCF is in the works, but most of the acronyms have been established. So, and he's not even joking. I mean, honestly, that's what they have. They have a building, they have acronyms. nobody really knows what the structure of this is going to look like. There's no clear idea about how the money is going to, how people are going to decide where the money goes, who's going to decide any of that. It's like all totally up in the air still. But if you build it, they will come, I guess. And so given the already strong self-perpetuating relationship between adaptation and development in existing mechanisms, the establishment of the GCF, which will contain 1,000 times the amount of money that's currently in the Adaptation Fund, it's going to likely, in my opinion, secure the future of the adaptation development machine, and that's the idea that adaptation and development perpetually reinforce each other. I had some notes on the effects of this in Alaska, since that's sort of the theme of these lunchtime talks. And maybe we can talk about that in the discussion so that you guys have more ideas about that than I do. And so I'll just wrap up there with any questions that you guys have. Yes.
Sure, a couple comments.
Please.
Thank you. I worked in Tanzania. I can imagine the agencies fighting over.
Yeah, right.
But I think I understand your talk, or at least some of the points. Kind of, this is a case study of, you're using adaptation, but of the frustration or the difficulty in doing development funding. All organizations would love to see governments in developing countries meeting those five, I don't know if you have those 5 criteria in a slide, but meeting those five criteria. Many of them, I don't know the enforcement process or the hoops that the Adaptation Fund is using, but that's the goal, basically. The developing countries can take responsibility, can do evaluation, don't have corruption, whatever. So many agencies have tried to help that process along, and which is what it sounds like this agency is doing, saying, boy, if you meet these criteria, we'll fund you directly. But in the meantime, the international agencies, especially the bank, which is often vilified, but does a pretty good job, I know because it does a much better job than, say, USAID, of trying to work directly with entities in a country and trying to ensure that those, at least the basics of those criteria are in place. There's a lot of donors in a lot of fields, as you know. So the international organizations, in a sense, serve sometimes as a proxy. It's frustrating because they may not delegate total control. On the other hand, they're trying to find organizations within those countries that they can work with, and in many cases, they're trying to strengthen them in one capacity or another to improve generally. So I don't think it's really such a black and white thing. The other is, I was thinking as you were talking about China, and put out the last slide with some, and I thought maybe you're going to mention China, because one of the end runs that's going on, I don't know about adaptation at the moment, but if you think about development in general, of which certainly some projects that are adapting to changing environment I would think be included. A lot of African countries who don't want to go through this process, whether I don't mean what the fund, but even meeting the criteria of many development agencies who will impose evaluation criteria, disbursement criteria, and in some ways are just going to the Chinese will fund almost anything, no strings attached. And it's really creating, on one hand, an opportunity. Why would a government bother to either meet these very rigid criteria to get funding, or even meet the criteria that many lenders are imposing, or donors, when the Chinese are just saying, here, you want to build an X, here's the money. So I don't know if you've come across that, but I think it's a real challenge in terms of trying to strengthen institutions one way or another. And money that's coming in, which on the one hand, you might argue is really speeding up development, because there's a tremendous amount of Chinese financing and Chinese construction. We could say a lot more about Chinese development. But one of the things I know from talking to people in development is that Chinese aid at the moment is very much no strings of the kind that you were mentioning attached.
Yeah, those are great comments. I think first your comment about how things are not quite black and white between the direct access and the working through the World Bank, for example. And I agree with that. I think, they're definitely not black and white. At the same time, I think that there's specific critiques that are levied against an organization like the World Bank that are fair enough. I mean, it's not a perfect organization, even if it's not totally as evil as some people paint it up to be. But the direct access modality is really trying to remedy some of those, or go around some of those critiques, trying to avoid them. And so that's what it's trying to do different. And the thing that I think is a problem with the way the Adaptation Fund is handling it is that they aren't actually offering any financial support or any kind of support, institutional support or anything to pass this accreditation process.
And is anybody else coming in, any other donors
yet.
to say, we'll help you with the
No, sometimes
institutional
countries,
strengthening to
Right.
help you meet those criteria?
sometimes countries are able to like levy raise the funds, within themselves or with another organization, maybe on an individual level, but not really that I've seen. And there's a little bit. The Adaptation Fund would like to help with that, but they don't have the money to, and it's not really in their mandate. And so they've done a couple like regional workshops. So I'm talking like Africa-wide workshops for building an accredited organization. But they do it with almost no money, and it's like a 2-day workshop for whoever can afford to send somebody. So it's not very
I've seen
effective.
many of those in Alaska.
Right. I mean, there's so many. I'm sure there's so many parallels with what I've seen going on in Tanzania and what's going on here. And so then your second comment was on Chinese development, and I've seen a lot of Chinese development in Tanzania. It's been increasing, and just in the 7 years that I've been working there, it's like noticeably increased. And I don't know a lot about it. I'm highly suspicious about anything that claims to be no strings attached.
Well, the strings are not.
They're not
I guess I would
obvious.
agree with you that I suspect that the strings are much longer term in terms
Right.
of
Yes. Which is potentially more
political
dangerous.
commitment, and we're already beginning to see. But in terms of the criteria that you mentioned,
Right.
which many agencies would require some version of meeting those. My understanding is that in many cases, the Chinese part, those are waived.
What I could imagine is I've heard about major land grabbing going on in Tanzania by the Chinese in particular for agricultural production, and also for mineral extraction. And I don't know if there's any relationship between how they fund something like adaptation or development and then the relationships between that, but I could imagine that, yes, if they give you no strings attached development money, maybe they would expect you to turn a blind eye towards allowing them to snap up a lot of their empty land holdings. I don't know. Yes.
So you talked about 100 billion for the Green
Yes.
Energy Fund or the Green Climate Fund. What are the chances that it'll get anywhere near there?
Great question. I have no idea. I know that already, oh gosh, I can't remember the statistic offhand, of the 10 billion that they were supposed to be raising annually from 2009, I think, to 2012. Something like over 50% of that was not actually new and additional, so it was old development money that they relabeled as climate money, and so it's not any extra money going to anybody, it's just, relabeled old money. And then often, also, the other problem with this money is that it's not like, it doesn't need to be sort of tagged or labeled for anything specifically. Like, they have this 100 billion they want to generate, but it could totally go towards like carbon offset development in Africa or something, building more wind farms in order to offset, development in Germany or whatever. And it doesn't, it's not necessarily effective money, it's just money, it's just a number that they're giving. But I think it's unlikely. I mean, personally, I think it's highly unlikely that they'll actually be able to generate that much extra money. It's just not. And it doesn't, in particular for adaptation, it's a problem because right now, most developed countries don't see a whole lot of benefit for themselves in investing in adaptation in other countries.
I just one other question. The overlap between adaptation and development, because there have been a lot of examples, seems reasonably extreme. And I can't think of, other than the bureaucratic reason that some agency gives money for this and some don't, why I should care one way or the other. I mean, if it's...
Can I answer that, or did you want to answer that?
Well, no, I don't want to answer that, but so my question was going to be about rights-based approaches, and we've looked at those in the context of development, and then if that could maybe inform the approach to adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, it's very much an ethical question, because if you look at how the people that most need to adapt, or the people that are experiencing the most extreme effects of climate change, are not responsible for causing it. And so that's why it's important to differentiate adaptation from development. Adaptation is something that is totally an ethical argument on my part, but it's something that is like owed, the ability to adapt is owed to people based on the harms that have been caused by developed countries. And that's different from development, or inherently different from how
Okay, define development then.
Well, and isn't that the transformation that the rights-based approach to development is trying to engender? Is that this notion that you had one slide in there about obligation and donation or something like that? And it's getting away from that idea within the context of development to look at this as more like you just described adaptation, is that developing countries have a right to develop. And so then taking that, morphing that, or applying that to I mean.
Yeah, so we're saying that there's been this sort of new movement within development towards what's called rights-based approaches, in which people
rights-based
approaches. And you see something similar going on in adaptation, people talking a lot about human security and people having a general right to having human security, and that includes like security of their livelihoods, security of their health, well-being, of their belief systems, everything. And so, yeah, I think, Mara, I would say that development in general is moving in that direction, but it's pretty new, and it's not all, I think most development probably doesn't necessarily have that perspective.
Right, but I like what your linkage between adaptation then, because it infuses that
Right,
notion.
and I think adaptation really could be an amazing opportunity to sort of make a development happen in a better way.
Exactly.
If people start to look at it from that perspective. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks.
As far as Alaska goes, too, I mean, one thing I found is that, everybody here I'm sure knows it, but our state is much more in the developing scheme, and yet we're stuck in a developed world.
Yeah.
So we're kind of screwed. And I'm wondering if there's any provisions to allow for that. Probably not.
No. This is a major problem, I think, in terms of what's going on internationally, is that you see minority or marginalized populations in developed countries completely erased from what's going on. And so they have these annual climate summits, one going on right now in Poland, and you do see actually a pretty large presence there of indigenous people from developed countries that go, and they actually are starting to like join together so that their voices are heard a little bit more. And it's really an interesting way of what they're trying to do actually in a lot of cases is to sort of jump the national level when they often feel frustrated by the failure of their own governments to support them, and going to the international level where they can get maybe a bit more attention, higher profile. So that's happening, which is neat, but unfortunately at the international level there's not a lot of provisions for actually helping those people. Do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I think that's another connection with Alaska and with the North, that indigenous people in Canada, US, Alaska, Greenland, and to some extent Scandinavia, are trying to get more involved in various international forums, certainly in Arctic Forum, but in international forums, so that they can, as you say, find partners and find a way to leapfrog. Because if you talk to senior people in UN organizations, they'll often say, I had no idea that there were areas in your country that had some of these same problems, because they don't hear that from, if you're there representing the United States, you're there as a major country who's a donor, who's an industrialized, or a potential donor, who's an industrialized northern country protecting its interests, rather than saying, yes, we agree that some of these problems are universal, or there's some, and Australia too fits in that category. So I think that indigenous movement's an interesting one to follow, and to see if it can break through some of these legal national barriers in terms of how the funds and organizations are constructed.
Since you raised that question, I'm just wondering to what extent it really is different in developed countries, because it seems to me one of the biggest criticisms of sort of the mitigation policy in development is that the elites in developing countries who are responsible for generating just as much, maybe sometimes more emissions, as their people in developed countries are using their lack of development as a cover for not doing anything, just the way we are. Yeah. I guess I'm suspicious that the same is true for these adaptation projects. It's that
that's sort of a fundamental problem.
In fact, the direct-to-government relationship may make it even worse. And I guess I was thinking, well, here's an example. I can give an example of a country that probably could be pretty close to having organizations that would meet the accreditation criteria, but probably isn't getting any of this assistance, and that's Cuba. Because it's not part of the development paradigm. So I just wonder, to what extent is there sort of, have you encountered sort of a bumbling, good intentions, but not thinking very self-critically about what people are doing versus just outright hypocrisy in these organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both, I think, most of it depends on the individual person that you're talking to. I think in general, though, the critiques that you're talking about are just true of probably anything going on in the United Nations, because they're, that's the scale that they work at, is with national level global governments. And it's, nearly impossible, I think, to remedy within the framework of the United Nations, for sure. You would have to, start looking at alternate options for funding adaptation somehow outside of that, which would be great. But the United Nations right now is really where it's at in terms of starting to do any kind of broad-scale adaptation funding.
Yeah, and just sort of the corollary that I found it really interesting and ironic that financing for this is supposed to come from these international carbon credits. That the reason, of course, that they're worthless is because the developed countries have not decided to take it seriously. So there's no obligation to mitigate. So of course, it doesn't get you any benefit either.
Yeah, there was really high hopes, I think, when the idea of doing the 2% tax was first put forth. I think people thought there was a chance that the carbon market would really take off. It didn't.
Well, it's because it's in other words, the lack of seriousness of any country developed or anything for actually mitigating climate change, of course, makes the adaptation challenge much greater, and at the same time takes away the financing for it.
Yes.
Total
Yeah, it's actually really unfortunate that they're linked in a way, because that just means that the worse the problem, there's no solution to the problem of climate change, and that there's less and less of one as people continue to fail to mitigate, and that just means that adaptation will be more and more needed, and less funded. That's a great point.
We're almost at 1, so what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank our speaker.
Yeah, thank you guys.